Hello and welcome to this video. I spotted a comment on one of my videos recently. I can't remember who put it up. I read it and then it went round my mind. And I'd have to go through all the comments and search to find out who wrote it. So I apologise for whoever suggested this. But I am going to take on the question that was asked in this comment, which was, why do all modern jazz musicians sound the same? Okay, so I sort of agree with this. I have a big network of musicians I know. We're always checking out new players, and very often someone will go, "Oh, Andy, because I'm a drummer, go and check this drummer out. You've got to check this drummer out," and they'll send me a link across. And I can sort of predict what I'm about to see. You know, the modern jazz drummer is going to do a whole ton of things, and we know what they're going to do. The virtuoso level of modern jazz players is off the charts now. You know, everybody is incredible, unbelievably fast. They're blistering. They're going to be playing the sort of, you know, gospel chops derived fills. We're going to be getting the sort of metric modulation. We're going to have, you know, the sort of crossovers between the hi-hats and the floor tom. I can sort of predict what I'm about to see. Now, that seems to be the case right across the board. When someone says, check this guitarist out, I know I'm going to get something which is somewhere between Metheny, Schofield and Holdsworth. You know, there's going to be that sort of sound. Now, if we go back, say, to the 1950s, and I would say, you know, like, name some jazz pianists. So let's say Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck, Bud Powell, Bill Evans. There's four pianists off the top of my head, so I really haven't prepared this. Each of those is a whole complete world of difference to the next one. They're instantly recognisable. I've just, you know, filmed a video on Jaco Pastorius, and the overriding thing that came out of that, because I've been listening to so much Jaco recently, is as soon as Jaco's on that album, you go, oh, Jaco's on that album. Oh yeah, you hear that? Oh, doesn't he sound amazing? You can hear him beaming out, okay? I think this is the first place we can start to try and explore why individualism in jazz has diminished. I'm sure people are going to now start shouting all sorts of musicians at me, which they believe are highly individual, okay? But we are talking about not individual cases here, but a certain trend. And I think the fact that a number of people have said this to me over the years, you know, about modern jazz musicians, that I think by exploring it and having a look at the context in which jazz is made today might give us a clue to why people at least perceive that as happening. Okay? So let's go back to the sort of the Thelonious Monk, Bill Evans, Jaco Pastorius example that we just had. You know, in the old days, you could buy an album and you put that album on, and that album is coming to you through your ears. You know, nobody's listening with their eyes, they're listening with their ears. You know, you put the album on and that album has a voice on it. Now, one of the great innovations of jazz was the development of the idea of the individual voice. Now, having an individual voice is actually quite difficult in music, because music is based upon composition, and compositions are based upon somebody writing something that is then going to be performed by musicians, and those musicians need to be predictable. Okay, you need to know what a bass is going to sound like. You need to know what a violin is going to sound like. You know, if Beethoven's writing a piece for orchestra, and everybody in that orchestra had their own sound. You know, one guy's playing his violin with a saw, and the next one's doing loops and delays and all that. It just doesn't work, you know. For composition to work, there has to be some predictability in the sound. When jazz emerges, because there's an improvisatory aspect, it allows musicians to find their own place. Louis Armstrong is the great genius of this, in terms of his trumpet playing and his voice, in the way he places his personal voice. Now, the thing is that this coincides with the emergence of the recorded music industry. And so people are buying records. And And when you buy a Bing Crosby album or a Frank Sinatra album or an Ella Fitzgerald album, you know, if you buy an Aretha Franklin album or a David Bowie album, what you're buying is the sound of their voice. You're not buying virtuoso singing. Virtuoso singing can sound very similar, right? What you're sounding is the grain and the tone and the timbre of the voice, the way it's phrased, the individuality that is within that sound. This is the bedrock of commercial music. If you're listening, if you're buying music to have a commodity, then you want an individual voice. Now, certain people in the old days, and this was far more apparent when I was younger, there would be people who would really love the trombone, or they would love the sound of the flute, or they would love the sound of the tenor saxophone. And so they would want to hear tunes that they liked played by that instrument. They liked the sound of that instrument. Jazz musicians emerged in the 20s and 30s playing tunes, and people would hear the tune played by that instrumentalist. And to become a star, you had to be like a Bing Crosby or an Elvis Presley. You had to have your own voice. So the recorded music industry was driving musicians to have their own voice that could then be marketed, you know, on a record. You know, Stan Getz plays the Burt Bacharach, you know, that type of an album. Wes Montgomery plays the Beatles, you know, whatever it is. That is a sound, you're buying into a sound. And that would have driven, I think, the music industry to find people with an individual sound. And so within the industry, and when you talk to older jazz musicians, this is definitely the case, that to be seen to be copying somebody else's sound was seen to be morally wrong. You know, it was that strong a thing, you know, or they're copying my sound. You could see this up with, say, a musician like Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth has such a signature sound. You know, Alan Holdsworth can play a tune and it's going to be entirely different to Jeff Beck playing a tune or John McLaughlin playing a tune. They're all going to sound entirely different, even though it's the guitar. And so what is the point of copying Alan Holdsworth? Now, there's a million Alan Holdsworth copiers out there, a million of people trying to do it. So what's happened morally where people now think it's a good thing to sound like somebody else? You know, all these forums where people are trying to find out what amp did Alan Holdsworth play and what guitar and what gauge of strings, because I want to sound exactly like him, right? That, I think, is something that's emerged, and I want to now explore the next part of the jigsaw puzzle of why everyone's sounding more and more the same. So if you take the bedrock of the recorded music industry, and in the old days, you know, people were buying records which they were selling the sound of a person, an individual. So you're buying a Stan Getz album because you want it to sound like that. You want to hear John Coltrane because you want him to sound like John Coltrane, right? As the music industry collapses, people are no longer consuming jazz so much on record. We are consuming it streamed through the internet, and in most cases the thing that has saved jazz and jazz fusion has been YouTube and Instagram, where musicians are now plying their trade in a completely different way. And that has now become much more based upon virtuosity. We are listening with our eyes so much more. In the old day, the virtuosity was there, but the virtuosity was at the service of the compositions and the album. It was reined in. You know, a jazz fusion band would have to get a deal. And once you've got a deal, then you have to write some tunes, and that tunes has to be sort of okayed by the label. You know, there's commercial constraints, you know. So, you know, just shallow displays of just sheer virtuosity didn't mean anything. You know, when you listen to, say, Jaco Pastoris's debut album, which is a brilliant example of a virtuoso musician, you know, being launched into the world. What Jaco's doing is at the service of the music. There is so much composition on there. And we're astonished at the virtuosity within the context of what he's trying to achieve musically. You know, so if you're playing Donna Lee, it's the beauty of that phrased, you know, melody that Charlie Parker creates. And then it's interesting because he's playing it on a bass, and you think, oh, the bass is usually associated with playing these sort of detailed lines, but this guy's been able to do it. That's really impressive. That's where the virtuosity comes in. It's at the service of that tune. With Instagram, it's not like that. We are just literally appreciating just big slabs of raw skill being thrown at us. You know, it really is. I was going to come up with a metaphor of somebody waving in a large, a large appendage on their body at you. It's like that. As I hope I'm not going to pass on from that. Let's just carry on talking. You know what I'm saying? This is something that's really emerged, and in a way, this has saved jazz, because it's YouTube has enabled musicians to keep going. God knows what would happen if there was no YouTube. That I think jazz would be dead, pretty much. Here's the interesting thing, and this is the third part of this anomaly, I think, that we have in today's jazz scene, is that most musicians, that interest in virtuosity emerges in musicians in their teens. You know, it's a little bit like the sort of, you know, the younger musician looking up to the older musician, you know, and going, oh my God, look how incredible they are. And that's a thing that really emerges in rock music. Most musicians start in sort of heavy metal, and they're really impressed by their heroes in heavy metal. And as you start to develop as a musician, you start to change. Some musicians do, at least, and they start to realise there's an even harder thing than playing fast heavy metal, and it's playing jazz. But when they discover that, what they discover is playing through the changes. They discover playing all these weird scales, right? Being able to superimpose chords, all that stuff which has become associated with jazz. Now, that really is not a jazz thing, it's a bebop thing. So the bebop has emerged in the 1940s, and in an almost sort of punk rock way, they were trying to challenge the orthodoxy of swing musicians by just making the music listenable rather than danceable. This was a change. You know, those musicians wanted to create serious music that was equal to classical music, but was their own music. And so they made the music very complex. And one of the ways they did that was to take the changes and just expand the changes out. This pretty quickly, to any creative musicians, became a bind, as punk rock did in the 70s. Punk rock only lasts a few years, and true bebop only really lasts a few years. By the late 40s, Miles Davis is questioning it, Lenny Tristano's questioning it, the whole bunch of musicians are actually wondering that this straitjacket of the chord changes, the straitjacket of having to jump through those hoops, is how do you bust that open. And Coltrane and Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy are searching for ways, and all the free jazz musicians are searching for ways of breaking that open. You know, they're trying to use modality, they're trying to use time with no changes, to free musicians so they don't have to work in that, right? That way of playing really informs jazz fusion, and you could see that jazz fusion is almost like the commercialization of free jazz and modal jazz. And it's jazz fusion in the 70s is a little bit like swing in the 30s. Jazz is suddenly really, really popular. There is, of course, the backlash against that, as there was to bebop in the 1950s. You had the trad jazz, especially here in the UK. You had trad jazz musicians who were trying so hard to emulate Kid Ory and Louis Armstrong and King Oliver, you know, really earnestly. They didn't like anything that was after a certain point in time. That happened in the 50s, and it happened again in the 1980s with that whole Wynton Marsalis, backwards looking, you know, standing there in a suit pretending it's 1962 and you're in a hard bop group. And that created this idea as jazz, you know, lost its foothold in the clubs, right? It lost its footholds on the street, you know, and it moved into the music colleges, okay? And the music colleges started to teach jazz as an ideological dogma. This is the way you play jazz. You know, that whole thing with Alex Hoffman, criticising Wayne Shorter. Alex Hoffman is just a brilliant example of a musician that's been gone in and has been indoctrinated into the ideology of jazz. And jazz only has true worth when you're doing a number of things, and those things have to happen for it to be good jazz. And there's so many jazz snobs around that will tell you what jazz should be, right? And of course, as soon as that happens, the form is hobbled. So we now have an industry of music colleges churning out jazz virtuosos who have nailed giant steps and have got all the Charlie Parker lines down, and they've learnt all their super Lockyer and natural fourth scales and altered scales and Lydian flat sevens, and they can blast them over all their chord substitutions and all that, and 1,000,000 miles an hour, and they've got all their technique, and they've copied their sound, and the sound, if you're a saxophone player, is basically Michael Brecker, and if you're a drummer, it's basically sort of Dave Weckerly, Steve Gadd, Vinnie Colaiuta, and if you're a bass player, you're going to have a little bit of Jacko, a little bit of Marcus. It's all become a great big cliche tied up in an ideology that basically binds you into having to do something in a certain way. And what has been the sacrifice for that? It's been the sacrifice of musicians, being urged morally to not do that, to do something new. There's a brilliant quote by Keith Jarrett when he was in Miles Davis' band, and somebody said, "What was Miles like?" And he said, well, Miles would rather have been in a bad band playing bad music, I'm paraphrasing this, than play what he had played before. That is a true jazz musician. The jazz giants that emerged, right? They were coming from a different place, and their experimentation was at the forefront of music. The musicians like Coltrane, who pioneered all the stuff that people are now copying in colleges, that was done on the bandstand. These guys would read about some weird scale, and then they would go up there and they would play it, and they would find out, because they wanted not to play the scale because it was clever, because they were trying to free music. They were trying to bust it out of the place where it is now. That used to be the job of jazz. Jazz was a nuclear reactor that you threw music in and new forms came out. Now the problem is, when you do that, is sometimes new forms really do come out. And I think the jazz that I love, right, that beautiful, exciting period that runs from the 60s, say 1959 to around about 1974, that is an incredible run of classic albums like Kind of Blue, Mingus R. Giant Steps, Time Out by Brubeck. If you look at that watershed, which sums up everything that has happened in jazz, and then at that point it then splits off into all these different incredible forms. And the 1960s, which is that watershed period where arts are just moving at such an incredible rate. So we go from pretty much in 1959 Kind of Blue, by 1969 Miles is making Bitches Brew. It's an incredible travel, right? And I think what happened in the 60s is that what jazz musicians were doing went beyond the scope of jazz, right? You want to know where the influence of jazz is? It's always outside jazz, okay? I was watching a video the other day which was discussing the sort of little, what's the word? There was an interview in the 80s between Wynton Marsalis and Herbie Hancock, where it seemed like Wynton had thrown a pot shot at Herbie for making popular music, and Herbie then was in an interview where he basically told Wynton that he didn't understand pop music and he should keep his mouth shut. It's a fascinating discussion between the two, and on that video they make the point that Rocket by Herbie Hancock is not a jazz track. Okay, is it a jazz track or not? Well, It's not a jazz track, but it's entirely come out of jazz. And the whole thing about Rocket is Rocket was created by Bill Laswell. And Bill Laswell is a musician that emerged in the late 70s, who was pulling together free jazz influences, Ornette Coleman, with hip hop and free jazz, hip hop, punk, and was pulling all those things together at that time. Jazz played a huge part in the creation of that sound. Rocket is an example of a track that then goes on to change the sound of 80s music and change the music industry, change the way MTV works, because Herbie Hancock was one of the first black artists to be featured on MTV. All that is coming from jazz. It's not coming from what Wynton Marsalis is doing. It's not coming from what the mainstream jazz is doing. It's coming from somewhere else. And the problem is that once you shut that down, once you stop by putting the straight jacket of what jazz should be on musicians, right? You no longer have jazz. What you have is a museum piece. And I think that's what we've got today. And you will spot it all over YouTube and the internet with people telling you how to play jazz and what it should sound like and what it should be. And you will see how important the virtuoso element is, how it's the overriding thing, and how we've lost that joy and wonder of the sound of a great musician sounding like themselves. This is something that has gone out of our culture. Now, so I think for those people who have criticised my position, I would firstly say that even if it's not the case, it seems that there are a lot of people out there that think that it is. So there's a lot of people devouring modern jazz and feeling that the musicians do not have the individuality that they once used to have. All right. The other thing that's come up that I just want to, set straight is that, somebody's just said, Victor Wooten doesn't sound like Christian McBride. Well, Victor Wooten's 58 years old. We're talking about a guy that's been around for 30, 40 years. It's like, I'm not talking about music in the last 30 years, last 40 years. I'm talking about a situation that is existing now. And I think the reason why it's been exacerbated is because of social media and the way that works. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that on this video a little bit more. The main criticism against me, which I think has got some legs, is the argument about scarcity. And that is the argument that if you went back to the 1950s and you looked at most average players on the jazz scene, they would be copyists of Charlie Parker. And what I'm doing is I'm cherry picking in the past, certain musicians that are giants and that history has shown to be giants, and I'm putting them up against average musicians today. Now, I actually think that argument is a good argument, and I think it's got its place, but the perception is of a lot of listeners that it's not the case. And now the reason for that is because of the way we are devouring music at the moment, and that's changed. When I go when I check out a lot of musicians now, I'm no longer buying records and taking them home and putting them on and really listening to them. I'm tending to see stuff on YouTube or Instagram. Now, you could say, well, that's where you're at fault, but the problem is that is the mechanism now by which jazz musicians have to launch themselves, right? Now, I don't think that there aren't musicians around now on the jazz scene and on the wider prog scene and the fusion scene that aren't individual, and I've tried to champion them on this channel. In championing them on this channel, you see how difficult it is nowadays to put or give credit to somebody that doesn't sound like somebody else. All right. If we go back to the 1980s, for example, let's pick guitarists. So, if I start to think of 1980s guitar players, I'm thinking of Mike Stern, John Scofield, Bill Frisell, Alan Holdsworth, Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen, Stanley Jordan, Frank Gambale. Now, I could keep going like that, and all of those musicians, and I can keep going, Scott Henderson, all of those musicians I can recognise straight away, right? Now, that may be because I've really listened to them and I know their idiosyncrasies and what makes them an individual, and perhaps with these new players I haven't recognised that. But to counter that, I think one of the things you had back in the 1980s was record contracts. And when you've got a record, and I made this point on the last video, is for a record to work, that person has to have an individual voice. You know, if the whole recorded music industry is based upon that. When you buy a record by Steve Vai, you want it to sound like Steve Vai because that's what you've bought into. That is the thing that has created your interest in that musician. And this is the same is true with jazz musicians. Nowadays, it's not like that. So I think my answer to the scarcity argument would be that we are actually living culturally in a world where copying is actually rewarded, whereas in the old days copying was looked down upon. And that's the real difference that I'm trying to get across here. There's been a shift, right? So if we take one of those guitarists I just mentioned, let's take Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth, for me, he's a genius. He's a brilliant musician because he went his own way. He grew up in the 1960s. He assimilated a ton of different guitarists, but he also listened to different players, primarily saxophone players, people like John Coltrane. He listened to people like Keith Jarrett. And he wanted his guitar to sound different to everybody else. And he went on a voyage to try and do that, right? In doing that, he created something that was so unique that when musicians heard it on a record, his guitaring beamed out. Everyone was going, have you seen this guitarist? He doesn't sound like anybody else. It's like I've never heard anything like it. Now, the way he played, the legato way he played, the speed at which he played, the sound he had, the way he used the overdrive guitar sound, all of these things no one had heard before. Now, does this mean Alan Holdsworth was technically the greatest guitarist that had ever lived and no one had ever done? No, it was not. There's been guitarists going back to the beginning of the history of guitar that had the same technical ability as Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth was unique in that his technique, now what is technique? Technique is the method by which you achieve something aesthetically. You know, if you just want the guitar to sound like a big crunky open chord, then the technique to do that is just to strum the guitar and get that great big open chord. That is the method. You know, if you swap the word technique for method, you start to see that techniques are what we have to achieve aesthetic goals. Holdsworth was incredible because he'd done something new. No one had heard that before. Back in the 70s and early 80s, we had a recording industry where when you put that on a record, it was noticed, right? The fact that he did this then influences guitar players, and all of us start off by copying our idols. We want to play like our idols, and what that creates is a great big swathe of musicians that sound like their influences, all right? So Holdsworth comes out and everybody's now copying Alan Holdsworth, right? Now, Alan Holdsworth himself, if he heard a musician playing one of his licks, he would stop playing that lick. His whole aesthetic goal was to do his own thing, and he actually found it quite disturbing that musicians were trying to copy him because he is old school. He came out of a world where the aesthetic job of the musician was to try and create their own voice, all right? So I'm sure that there's hundreds of musicians out there that are copying Alan Holdsworth and copying John Scofield or Mike Stern or Bill Frisell, but really the artist still wants to have their own voice. So say you're a musician working today, so say you've developed your own voice, how are you going to put it out there, right? Now, on the internet exist all sorts of forums and groups, okay? There exists a whole network of music fans. Okay, now I'm very aware of this because I run this YouTube video, and this YouTube video is successful off the back of other artists. If I put up the top 10 Genesis albums or the 5 greatest Duke Ellington albums, what happens is Duke Ellington or what was the other guy I just mentioned? I've forgotten. What was it? Forgotten. That fan base comes to check out my channel, right? And then in checking out my channel, hopefully they go, well, I quite like this guy because he's saying interesting stuff. But I'm using other artists to pull people in. That's the clickbait. If you're a guitarist nowadays, right, and you sound like Alan Holdsworth, right, there is a way of marketing yourself by jumping into those social networks where there will be Alan Holdsworth fans, and those Alan Holdsworth fans, and some of them will actually have created a network around that guitarist, okay, and they exist off that. You know, they've got a website or a fanzine, or they're writing books or whatever it is, which is based upon the legacy of this guy. And so a guitarist then put into that place will get noticed, and he will or she will be judged on how much they relate to the initial legacy, okay? Within that will be gatekeepers, okay? And a guitarist that is trying to bust into that will have a problem, because if they don't sound like Alan Holdsworth at all, they won't get noticed. Everyone will say, well, that's a nice guitar playing like that, but they won't have any interest in it. If they do, then they're probably going to get shot down for sounding like Alan Holdsworth. But it's a no-win situation to be in that. Now, that applies, I think, for a whole bunch of players. Now, where does this come from? You know, now I think what's happened in jazz particularly, but this is happening right across the board in all the arts, in the whole of culture at the moment. But I think this really does go back to the 1940s with Charlie Parker. Anyone who studies Charlie Parker understands that that guy had, like Holdsworth, was so strong in his vision and his aesthetic and artistic goals that he changed a generation. That is the point, I think, where this started. And suddenly you had the Charlie Parker clones. And of course, Charlie Parker walked around wondering, why are these people all copying me? You know, why are they copying me for? That's where it started in the 1950s. Before then, if we go back to the 1930s and look at jazz back then, and we start to name names, if I say Lester Young, and then I say Coleman Hawkins, which are the two great saxophone players of that decade, what we have are two styles that are completely different. In terms of their tone, in terms of their vibrato, in terms of their phrasing, and in terms of their personality, I think. Musicians back in the 30s have a marked difference, and I think the reason for this keeps coming back to the way that commercial music works. That still existed in the 1940s, and if we take someone like Charlie Parker, Parker produced a whole bunch of musicians from that world. The musician that is probably the most important musician to come out of the bebop era, come out of Charlie Parker's band, is Miles Davis. Now, Miles Davis was a sound innovator. He was able to change the sound of the trumpet. And the trumpet, which is associated with that sort of Louis Armstrong sound, which is like a reveille, you know, it's a call to arms. It's bright and up. Miles inverted that, and he created a sound that was very introverted and quiet. And Miles Davis was able, with that sound, to play tunes that people knew. So he could play a tune like "Someday My Prince Will Come" from Snow White, which is a tune everybody knows, and is quite a cheesy, nice Disney tune. But when Miles plays it with that sound, he turns it into something completely different. It's a vehicle for introversion and introspection. All right, he was able to transform that music into something else. Now, Miles, in doing this, sold records. Miles really sold records in the 50s, and it's that aspect of his playing that made him a legend, right? Once he was existing as an artist in culture, right? And I'm making the argument that Miles first gets a foothold culturally because of his unique sound, because of this new way of transforming music through his sound. Once he was able to do that, he was then able to artistically do what he wanted to do, right? He was able to move jazz away from Charlie Parker. He was able to trump and go above what all those Charlie Parker clones were doing in the 1950s. The reason why he could do that is because Miles Davis never wanted to play anything that he'd played before or done anything that he'd done before, right? That aspect back in the 1950s, because there was a hunger for individuality. Have you ever heard the story about Ray Charles? You know, Ray Charles came out as a Nat King Cole copyist, right? He had a piano trio and he wanted to sound like Nat King Cole. But he was brought up in the church, and he'd got all these gospel tunes, and he was in the studio. And if you watch the Ray film, it's quite interesting because they dramatise this event where he was in the studio and he decides to do a gospel tune but rework the lyrics with lyrics that are much more baser, and it's the tune I Got a Woman. And when he started to do it and he started to play that tune, everyone in the studio was like, oh my God, it's something new. There's something new going on. And the record company's like, oh my God, there's a new sound. Phone up, there's a new sound. It's a bit like Back to the Future, you know, when Marty McFly starts to sound like Chuck Berry, and, you know, that Chuck Berry's brother. Listen to this is a new sound. This is my point. This is the very point. This is what we're really arguing. We're not arguing whether there are musicians around today who have some sort of individuality. I'm sure there are, but the world is against those people at the moment. Right? The world is against the promotion of innovation and individuality, and it is rewarding the copyists, right? And I am not having a go at the musicians that do that, because the pressure to do that is probably making musicians sit down and go, right, now how can I sound like so-and-so, and how can I display a ton of physical technique so that when I put that up onto Instagram and someone watches that for 5 seconds, they will go, I like that sound, and he's really good at it, or she's really good at it, or they're really good at it. You know, what? That is the change I'm talking about. And the argument here is not whether there's some individuals around that sound, you know, are doing something interesting. And, you know, like, for example, you know, a number of people have mentioned Louis Cole. Yeah, I love Louis Cole, and I think Louis Cole is an individualist. I can recognise his sound. Yes, there is that he is one of these guys. But Louis, to start off, has had to distance himself from jazz. It is jazz. It's jazz. But would the jazz world accept that Louis Cole is jazz? And the second thing is, he's done it through compositions. And the great artists were composers. This is something I didn't mention in the last video. That the great musicians were composers, and they created vehicles in which the new things that they'd innovated technically had a context. All right? Alan Holdsworth, a brilliant example of that is that once Holdsworth had that sound, both chordally and single line, you know, tonally, he was able to then write compositions that featured that sound. You know, and they were his compositions. They were vehicles for his genius. Today, the compositional aspect has really disappeared because, again, the channels in which a musician has to try and promote themselves are not conducive into someone buying into the composition. Okay? So, I hope on this video I have been able to clarify this discussion a little bit more. I want to finish before I go with trying to explain how YouTube works to you. Is that I am in the same business, right? So I have to put a title up which will make you look, okay? And that makes my position look very, you know, binary. all right? I am not a person that thinks there are no musicians around in the modern jazz scene that don't sound individual. What I'm doing is I'm taking that and I am opening up the discussion, right? Because there are gatekeepers within jazz. There's gatekeepers within rock. There's gatekeepers in fusion. There's gatekeepers within the whole of modern culture, and they sit there and they are allowing these things through, right? These are the new record labels, okay? In the old days, the record labels did this, but now it is people sat within forums, you know, Facebook groups, on Discord groups, on Reddit, and that is, they're the ones controlling it. And believe me, they have a vested interest in controlling it, right? It's never been the case that the artists, and I see myself as a musician and an artist, it's never the case that we have any power ever to be able to have a platform where people are coming to us because they're interested in new things, new ideas and new sounds, you know, and that's a shame. Because it takes time, you know. Musicians are always fighting against the listener's defense. You know, people treat new things as a threat, and the only way that they can deal with a threat when they first hear something new is by comparing it to something they already knew. This has always been the case for the whole of history, but again, modern social networks and the internet and all those digital technologies have exacerbated that in a way that we haven't quite been able to get control of or understand. But there was a lot of people in the comments that said what you're saying about jazz is true of the whole cultural sphere, all right? Films, art, music, television, you know, all sorts of artistic content is suffering from the thing I was talking about in that video. So I thought what I'll do here, because I agree 100%, is I want to explain a little bit the wider cultural context of where jazz sits right now and how it sits within that. Right, so I'm going to do that right now. So if you want to sit back and have a listen and see whether you agree or not. So I think that music, art, all of it, right? What fundamentally is going on with the arts is negotiating between perfectionism and hedonism, all right? Hedonism can be seen like the chaotic matter of the universe. It's all chaos, you know, and perfectionism can be seen as order. When you're an artist, you are totally aware that you're trying to negotiate your way through creating something that pulls those two ideas together, right? You're trying to create something which is perfect. Now, I describe perfection as tied to the grid. There is some imaginary grid. This grid doesn't exist, but you have invented this aesthetic grid, and you're trying to tie everything to that. You're trying to get it so it's massively in time, massively in tune, the right length. You know, that when you measure it on this imaginary aesthetic grid, that it fulfills that. But you're also trying to convey emotion, and emotion comes from all the stuff that's in the cracks between the grid. It's all the stresses and imperfections, right? When you create great art, you're trying to pull both of those things together. When we see a great piece of art, we describe it as sublime, and sublime can be seen as this chaos and order, the perfectionism and hedonism, you know, or you can see it as time and space. You can see it as, you know, heaven and earth, all these dichotomies that existed through the whole of human history. You could see those things are pulled together for that moment in time. Now, I think culturally, as human beings, because we have a problem balancing these two elements, we have invented the arts to do this, so we can recognise this. And the reason why we need the arts is because there is always culturally, politically, historically, the pull between chaos and order. It's always moving like this. These two things are pulling against each other the whole time. And we need to renegotiate that, okay? I think that if you look at human history from a cultural point of view, you could see a sort of cycle. And that cycle often goes from visceral, emotional art through to perfect art. Art that's really nailed to the grid. As you go to that point and you move through that, in the middle is often a sweet spot where you really get some incredibly sublime art, right? When we historically look back at these points, we're looking at it from our culture now. So if our culture is in a very perfectionist point, which I think we are, we will look back to the past and celebrate stuff which seems to be not like that seems a lot more about hedonism and visceral, emotion. And because of this, you get these cycles, I believe, culturally. Okay? Now, I don't want to go back to the beginning of history, but I want to go back about 100 or so years. Okay? Around about the point after the Second World War. Now, the First World War. The First World War had an incredible impact culturally. This was an awful war. It was the beliefs and ideas of that sort of Victorian generation, which had become hyper-moral, become perfectionists, and people went off to the war with that belief in their country, in empire, in doing the right thing, and they went straight into hell on earth, absolute chaos. And when we come out of the First World War, the culture's shifted, and we see the emergence at that point of jazz and blues. We also see the beginning of the jazz age. And if we think of the 1920s, you could see in the 1920s suddenly the culture has shifted. If you go back to 1880 or 1890 or 1900, we're pretty much in the Victorian Edwardian period, and people are pretty much the same. As soon as you come out to the 1920s, you've got loads of girls with short skirts on the back of airplanes doing high kicks, or some black trumpeters playing jazz, and all that. Suddenly everything's changed, right? And I call that the modernist period. The modernist period begins around about 110 years ago, after the First World War. It's all very exciting, and there's certain things coming through, but what we see with modernity is all about the future against this sort of visceral hedonism, and it's swimming around. So when we go back to the 1920s, we find all this very visceral hedonistic music. We're celebrating Robert Johnson, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. All this stuff is really, really exciting. The arts change. The arts almost a precursor to this. People like Picasso, with Demoiselle d'Avignon, that painting has moved from a sort of impressionist salon style of art to an art which is looking at primitivism. Its hedonism has emerged. You see it with The Rites of Spring by Stravinsky. You see it with books like Finnegan's Wake, Wasteland. Suddenly everything's changed, and we're in this visceral, hedonist, confused, chaotic world. All right. As the culture progresses, these ideas start to coalesce. By the 1930s in music, you could see that these ideas have been formulated. Louis Armstrong is a great formulator, and then you have people like Art Tatum, you have Duke Ellington, then you have Count Basie. These great things are formulated into working models. They start to bring in perfectionism. Duke Ellington brings in the compositional, he puts structure on it, and we start to get incredibly sublime pieces of music. That gets advanced more. We go into bebop, and the perfectionism starts to be put on even more. The visceral elements of jazz, for example, they start to be put aside. The visceral elements mean dancing and having a good time and all that type of stuff. That's put aside. Now we're going to listen. We're going to sit down and listen. Now bebop still has 80% of its DNA back in dance music. It's still there, right? But you can see that this thing is constraining. By the time we get to the 40s and 50s, we have this idea of the modern world. And the modern world is very prescriptive. It's all people in silver spacesuits, you know, drinking from tubes. Everyone's a cog in the machine. Everyone's conforming, you know. That suddenly becomes overwhelming. By the 1950s, you feel that that's overwhelming. You see it in filmmaking, you see it in music, and then that little seed that emerges. It emerges with the young people in the 1950s. You know, they turn to that visceral thing, rock and roll. They turn to it. You know, the filmmaking starts to change. You know, we go from abstract art to pop art at this point. We go from Hollywood studio system, the sort of perfectionist idea of how to make film, to the French New Wave in film. And this is happening throughout the 1950s. There's the seeds. And then when we get to the 1960s, that all collapses in and we have the era of rock and roll. Okay? At this point, jazz is has become so codified, and then in 1959 we have that great big breakdown of jazz where we have all those classic jazz records which are completely future looking. We go into free jazz, which is basically chaos again. We go into, you know, jazz fusion, which is basically jazz returning to its visceral hedonistic roots and putting a dance beat on everything. So you could see these cycles moving round over and over again, right? One of the things that emerges in the 1960s, and this is the era that we could call postmodernist, and I think I've identified it as really starting to tip over in 1962. 1962 things start to change, and again, if you look at somebody in 1970 and compare them back 15 years to 1955, it's two different types of people. If you take someone from 1955 and then take them back to 1945 or 1935, they're a similar type of person. That's the only way I can explain this, right? So what we move from modernity to post-modernity is, rather than celebrating people being a cog in the machine, right, of being part of the group, that sort of futuristic, you know, the Jetsons view of humanity, where we're all living in our little, you know, cocoon, you know, within the group. It's all a little bit Marxist. It's all a little bit, you know, sort of communal. You know, that idea of the future that we had in the 1950s, that breaks down. And the idea of individualism emerges in the 1960s. And this is really propped up by postmodernist theory, I think. We see it in rock and roll. We see it in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement in the 1960s is really saying, don't judge me on my identity group, judge me on me as an individual. You know, it's the whole Martin Luther King thing of judging someone by the content of their character. Suddenly individuality and self-expression become really, really important. And this is at the point in terms of music where the music industry is kicking in, right? The rock and roll is turning into rock music. And as I've said on the other video, if you want to market someone, they need to sound like an individual. This is the new thing, you know. They need to sound like Neil Sedaka, or they need to sound like Simon and Garfunkel. You know, you have to be able to recognise that. So self-expression becomes very important, and the skyrocket from 1962, right, to say 1969 when Hendrix gets up at Woodstock and plays the Star Spangled Banner, right? In those 7 years, culture changes. Now, what Hendrix was doing at Woodstock with Star Spangled Banner was basically playing avant-garde, free-form jazz, whatever you want to call it. It's one of the most avant-garde pieces. Imagine someone doing that on a bassoon, and we're in the territory of very esoteric free jazz. But at that point, it was so valuable to culture to celebrate the very embodiment of perfectionism and order, which is the American national anthem, but imbue it with the pain, with the chaos, with the torment of what it is to be human, to put that in, and also to do it in a way that is utilising modern technology, you know, the guitar as a sound synthesizer. All those things are so important that this crosses over into mainstream culture and it becomes a great event. And there are loads of these, right? We as a culture start to celebrate this. It starts to become really important. We champion it, right? The cultural forms start to champion it. And I think artistically, the late 60s, early 70s is like a golden age, right? Now we see attempts within that golden age to pull music back to its visceral roots, especially rock music. We see that in the mid-70s with the advent of punk. But all punk really does is just wind it all back in again and takes all those sort of progressive, ordered stuff and just it brings it down a touch, which then squeezes these ideas down into mainstream culture. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take like jazz turns into free jazz. Free jazz then becomes the basic improvisational approach to jazz rock fusion. Jazz rock fusion then is tempered by the visceral elements that emerge in the 1970s, which could be disco, and not so much punk with jazz, but it's disco and the beat, the groove, and musicians start to pull that in, and then those ideas are then transformed into the popular music form, and you get Michael Jackson's Thriller that wouldn't exist without jazz rock fusion, and it becomes the biggest thing in the world. So those things are pulled in, but they still exist. But what we can see is that those things getting pulled in, they start to become almost like ideological. These ideas start to become, this is how you do it. This is how you should do it, right? This is how you make a record. This is how you record drums. This is how you make a film. You know, we can see, you know, from the French New Wave film through the sort of films of the 1960s like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde, that moves into the sort of The Godfather, and all these American films have been influenced by this new way of making films, and then those filmmakers start to pull that in, and we get like Jaws, and we get Star Wars, and we get E.T., and then suddenly now people know how to make film, and it all becomes formularized. Everything becomes formularized, okay? Now, that has been going on for a number of years, and the individuality starts to shrink. It starts to get pulled in by the culture. Then a bomb goes off culturally, and it's the invention of digital technologies. Now, I cannot go into the full limits of that here in this video. You just have to, because you all know it. You know that the advent of digital technologies did so many things culturally that it's affected it on a massive level. Suddenly, if you've created a piece of art, like you've got a photograph of a painting or a piece of music, digital technology can copy that and replicate it instantly, so that you can't tell the difference. You know, when you listen to a digital recording, you hear numbers have analysed the sound, and then those numbers are going into an audio card in a computer and turning those numbers back into the sound, and we can't tell the difference. It sounds like the sound. You know, that replicates directly. Before then, you had to sort of record something across and it degraded. There was entropy in the system, but there isn't anymore. And with the advent of the internet, you can then take that digital piece of art, stick it on the internet, and it replicates 1 million times, 1 billion times. Once things are numbers, you could start to manipulate them. We're now at a point where people are starting to worry about AI and how do we control AI. And so there's the smaller implications of AI is that, you know, what if AI starts creating art and no one can tell the difference? All the artists are out of a job. But what if AI, what if we lose control of AI? You know, what if, you know, some foreign power that we don't like starts to use AI against us, you know? Are we going to end up in some totalitarian state where everybody is monitored? And then people look to the internet and they see that that's going on. Suddenly, there's this whole cancel culture thing. There's this whole woke thing where people, some people are really ensconced within their identity group. And that is dogmatic and it can't be questioned. You know, that those things are there and they're set in stone. We're no longer looking at somebody and judging them on the content of their character. We're judging them entirely now within their identity group, and there are a whole set of suppositions that go with that. And if you question that, then you you are questioning something that can't be questioned, and you need to be silenced because it's proof of your sort of heretical view. But on the other side of the political spectrum, we are going to a point where the control over redistribution, we're losing that. You know, companies are getting bigger, they're making more and more money, they can sell stuff to us, it's so much easier. You know, they can get inside our minds, and that control, that perfectionist grid is coming in. This is the world in which art and culture now exists. Now, I have faith in the arts, and I'm hoping that that seed of individuality, the thing that the computer, when it comes down to it, the computer and AI and digital technology and all the gatekeepers that exist on the internet that are not going to allow your stuff in if they don't feel it conforms to what they think music or art should be, all that stuff that's out there at the moment, right? There is one thing of value, and it is our individuality. It is our soul. It is our imperfections as human beings. You know, the computer, the internet, AI can only make a digital approximation of our imperfections. It can say, oh, they were imperfect, that's their imperfection there, I can replicate that imperfection. Once they do that, it's no longer an imperfection, it has become a platonic, absolute mathematical representation of the perfect realization of imperfection. It becomes something else. And if we value humanity, if we value us as a whole group, right, we need to value that visceral hedonist thing. Now, I'm a musician. I spent my formative years trying to get my playing as perfect as I possibly can. But perhaps it's gone too far. And the reason why my video resounded is because perhaps out there is a feeling that this whole perfectionist grid our culture has swung over that too much. It's gone too much over that way, right? And maybe the pendulum needs to swing back the other way. Now, will it? Culturally, at the moment, it seems like I'm saying something almost transgressive in saying that, you know, but hopefully this little discussion has been able to open up that, and hopefully I've been able to explain at least my personal view of how this all fits in the sort of history of culture. Anyway, I think I'll finish up there. Sure, I'm going to come back and discuss this more, and you know why? Because it gets clicks on my video, and I'm in the same game as everybody else. That populist idea of just trying to push the right button so you come and all watch. I would love to be able to come on here and talk about whatever I want, but no one's interested in that anymore, are they? They're interested in me, you know, manage to grab your attention for a few seconds because I push something that you already know, right? And that is fundamentally the thing we're all in at the moment. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. If you like it, like it. If you want to subscribe, and then subscribe and click the notification bell and all that. And if you want to support me in what I'm doing, where I can go and just talk about whatever I want, then go over to Patreon, and I'm pointing down there. I always do this now. I'm doing this without actually explaining. I'm pointing to the link down below, and become a patron and support me in what I'm doing. I would appreciate that very much. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.